Buddhism argues that all suffering is caused by desire or attachment. But what is the central cause of desire? It is the self. It is the belief that there is a self. So we're going to look at the Buddhist doctrine of Anatman, which in Sanskrit just means no self. So the Buddhist doctrine of no self, right? That they argue there is no self. Why is there no self? How can they say this? It seems to be intuitive that there's a self. How is there no self at all? So let's look at some of the early written argument from the Buddha, the middle discourses. Here there's this argument put forward that the well-taught disciple, right, who follows the Dharma, does not regard the physical body, feeling, perception, volition, and consciousness as their true self. Now first, what is it with the physical body, feeling, perception, volition, and consciousness, right? These are known as the five skandhas. The five skandhas were, in classical India, the different components that were believed to make up the self. So, of course, the physical body, bones, the form one takes, the skin, other things like that, right? The actual things that are material. Next is feeling. So just, straight sensation, really kind of rough sensation, right? Perception is awareness of, or an ability to classify, right? Like I see blue, I feel heat, right? So it's an ability to classify perception. So we perceive distinct things. So you kind of labeled them. Volition then is the will, right? So of course the mind directing perception at certain things, we might think. And consciousness is just the awareness of these different aspects of the self, awareness of being, perceiving certain things, awareness of what we desire, awareness of our physical body, right? Those different things. Now, specifically, the Buddha says that since the well-taught disciple, regards this, he is not agitated about what is non-existent. So the one who does not regard these five skandhas as that which makes up their self is not agitated. They are relieved of suffering. Why? Why does the self specifically arouse sorrow, lamentation, pain, grief, and despair? Why is it that one who thinks, I, Austin, there really is an Austin here? Why does this cause me pain? It would seem like this might be, the self would be, the source of my ability to overcome pain, to overcome suffering, and other things like that. So the Buddha says, hearing the teaching of the Dhamma, Pali for what is right, or the teachings, right, the true teachings, the true Dharma in the Sanskrit, he thinks thus: so I shall be annihilated, so I shall perish, so I shall be no more. Then he sorrows, grieves, and laments. He weeps, beating his breast, and becomes distraught. That is how there is agitation about what is non-existent internally. That it is the belief in the self that when we think, I'm going to die, right? I have an existential crisis. Perhaps we have existential angst. We don't know, right, what to do in our lives because we feel like, well, I only have this time to exist right now. I have to do what is right because I'm going to die. Maybe then we worry about death. What is death going to be like? All these different things cause us pain. If we believe that there is no self, then of course it makes no sense to think, Austin, I'm going to be annihilated when I die if there is no self, right? No, there is no one Austin that is to be annihilated. There is no Austin to worry about there being no more because there is no Austin. Right? So this should bring a kind of a calmness or tranquility, that if there is no self. And that seems kind of absurd. We might think if there is no self, that would cause an existential crisis. But the Buddha says no. If you recognize there is no self, you will no longer worry about those things that when we become attached to the idea that there is a me and I have to care for me in a certain, way to live out certain desires or other things like that, certain beliefs I might attach to myself and then I feel like I have to fulfill. So why? Let's get into the argument specifically why there is no self. Now, the Buddha argued that all things are dependently originated. That means nothing arises through its own accord. There's a specific argument then that because all things are dependently originated, that means the self is impermanent. It is not lasting, right? Now we think typically that there's either, we could take the position that there's a me, which is an Austin, and I am physical, right? And maybe then I die when my body ceases to continue subsisting. Maybe we take the view that there is a soul. The soul is the real me. The body is kind of just like a paint job we put on a car, right? It's not the real thing. It's just an appearance. And that after we die, of course, the soul lives on. Perhaps we take the Advaita Vedanta view that, the physical body is not the self. The self really is everything. But what the Buddhists want to say is all those different things, except for, of course, if you think the self is the physical body, believing that there is a soul, for example, that subsists throughout time before your physical body was born, and it will be there after your physical body perishes, or the Advaita Vedanta view, which also takes the true self, the Atman, to be permanent. Even if, of course, the Atman is everything, it's still something permanent, that therefore it must be independently originated, because only those which arise dependent on other causes, those cannot be things which are permanent, because they require something else to bring them into existence. So the argument works like this. That which is permanent arises independent of other means, right? Often I should say, this is the belief of God, that God is the only thing that is the cause of its own being. Everything else is dependent on, of course, God. And so they're saying, okay, if we want to say there are things which are permanent, then it must arise independent of other means. Premise 2 then. All things that arise dependently cease to exist and are therefore impermanent. Premise 3. Well, take fire. Fire burns on dependence of fuel. Perhaps it's a certain fire that's burning on dependence of, grass and sticks. We know that there's a time when a fire does not exist, and there's a time when the fire goes out. When the fire is extinguished, it does not make sense to say that it goes anywhere, right? When the fire is gone, it's just gone. It does not make sense to say it went north, it went south, it went over there, it went back to the abstract immaterial form of all fires. That means the fire arises dependently, and the fire is impermanent. Likewise, then, the self arises on dependence of the 5 skandhas. The self arises on dependence of a physical body. So it needs a physical body, to move around and grab things, to get food, fuel, right, for it to continue. Feeling to know, hey, something is hot, it's going to burn me, it could kill me, or other things like that. Perception, awareness of food, volition, a desire to go and get food, consciousness, a general awareness of all the different things that are required for a self to do anything at all, for there to be a self, right? But the thing is, if then a self arises on dependence of the 5 skandhas, if it doesn't make sense to talk of the self without the 5 skandhas, then that means when any of the 5 skandhas cease to exist, and we know, of course, the physical body will cease to exist, everyone dies, then that which gives cause to the self ceases. It ceases to exist, and just as it doesn't make sense to say the fire goes anywhere, likewise it doesn't make sense to say the self goes anywhere. It doesn't make sense to say, well, consciousness goes somewhere else. It doesn't make sense. There's no empirical evidence of that. It doesn't make sense to say that, the feeling goes anywhere else, or the physical body. The physical body does, but it breaks up. It decomposes, right? There's no one physical body that goes somewhere else. Therefore, the argument is the self is something impermanent. It's not something that subsists throughout time. Now, that the self is impermanent does not yet mean there is no self. It just means there's not a self which subsists through time, like what someone that thinks there might be a soul is, or that, someone who thinks there's the physical body is the self, or whatever else, right? We've only established that the self is impermanent, at least when taken to be the five skandhas. Why then cannot any one of those things specifically be the self? Why can't there be something else which is the self? If there's not a self, right, then how can I, Austin, even question that there is no self? I mean, this is something that, like, Rene Descartes, for example, in the Meditations on First Philosophy, argued, that when I doubt my own existence, I necessarily have to prove an existence of my own self, my own self existing. Otherwise, there couldn't be one to ask the question in the first place. Now, Descartes perhaps overlooked the fact that when he says, well, there must be something which exists, he says, well, it must be the self, the I, the ego. But why? Why is that the only option? The Buddhists are going to give a different argument and say, yes, there is thought, but there is no self. There is no real self that is the source of this thought. The thought is dependent on other causes, a whole multiplicity of causes. So I want to look at the famous questions from the King Milinda, or Menander as he's also known, involving this famous bit about a chariot here. So there's this encounter between a monk, Nagasana, a Buddhist monk, Nagasana, and this Greek king, Menander. And the Greek king, Menander, confronts him. So I want to read from some of this. So, and then the king Menander went to see the elder Nagasana. When he reached the place where the elder was, he exchanged greetings with the elder Nagasana. After he had thoughtfully given the proper salutations and inquired about the elder's health, he sat before him respectfully. The elder Nagasana returned the salutation so that King Menander would feel at ease. And then King Menander addressed the elder Nagasana with these words. What do people call the venerable? What is your name, venerable? I am called Nagasana, O great king. Those who practice a celibate life with me address me as Nagasana. Moreover, my parents named me Nagasana, and they also called me sometimes Surasana, or Virasana, or Siyasana. And yet, O great king, this is a metaphor, a conceptual construct, a verbal designation, a convention, merely a name, this Nagasana. For nowhere among us will you find a person. This seems contradictory on its face. How can it be that there is someone named Nagasana who is talking, and yet there is no Nagasana? So continuing. And then the king Menander said, May all of you, sirs, the 500 Greeks and the 80,000 monks, listen to me. The venerable Nagasana has now said, Nowhere among us will you find a person. Should one accept this as an intelligent observation? And then King Menander addressed the elder Nagasana with these words. If it is true, venerable Nagasana, that nowhere among us will we find a person, then who is it that gives you the essentials of the monk? Robes, food, lodgings, and furnishings, and medicine for the sick. Who is it that makes use of and enjoys these essentials? Who observes the principles of morality, right? So who does all the things? Who follows the Dharma? We might want to ask. Who applies himself to meditation? Who experiences the path, its fruits, and nirvana? Who harms and destroys living things? Who takes what is not given to him? Who follows wrong paths of sensual desire? Who speaks falsehoods? Who drinks intoxicating liquor? Who commits the 5 sins entailing immediate retribution? Therefore, if what you say is true, there is no good or evil. There's no one who performs good or evil actions, and no one who makes others carry out these kinds of actions. There is neither the fruit of virtuous and unvirtuous actions, nor their ripening. If, venerable Nagasena, someone were to kill you, this person would not be guilty of destroying a living being, right? Because there is no Nagasena, it would seem. Venerable Nagasena, you have no teacher, no preceptor, no ordination in the monastic order, So when you say, I'm called Nagasena, O great king, those who practice the celibate life with me address me as Nagasena. Who is this Nagasena? Is Nagasena then, O venerable, the hairs on your head? He says, certainly not, great king. Is Nagasena the hairs on your body? Certainly not, great king. The fingernails? Certainly not, great king. Is Nagasena the skin, the flesh, the sinews, the bones, the marrow, the kidneys, the heart, the liver, the pleura, the splena, the lungs, the intestines, the mesentery, the stomach, the feces, the bile, the phlegm, pus, blood, sweat, fat, tears, the lymph, saliva, mucus, synovial fluid, the urine? Is Nagasena the brain? Certainly not, great king. Is Nagasena then the totality of his body? So if we take, if Nagasena is not any one of those individual things, perhaps then Nagasena is the totality of all those things. So all of them taken together makes Nagasena. But Nagasena says, certainly not, great king. Is Nagasena then his feelings and sensations? And that seems to make intuitive sense. Perhaps we are feelings and sensations, right? We are that which feels a desk or pain or happiness. He says, certainly not, great king. Is Nagasena then his perceptions and conceptions? Perhaps then Nagasena is that which is, perceives colors, perceives a beach, perceives a painting. He says, certainly not, great king. Is Nagasena then his habitual tendencies? Maybe that makes even more sense. Nagasena is one who likes music, who plays music. Nagasena perhaps is one who eats Italian food, but not, hamburgers or things like that. But he says no. Is Nagasena then his consciousness? Nagasena, if he's not perceptions, volition, any of those things, Nagasena seems to have to be his consciousness at least, right? That which is aware then of all those different things that makes it up. He says, certainly not, great king. Is Nagasena then, O venerable, body, sensations, conceptions, habits, and consciousness all together? So perhaps then Nagasena is the 5 skandhas taken together. That's what makes Nagasena. He says, certainly not, great king. Is Nagasena then, O venerable, something separate and distinct from body, sensations, conceptions, habits, and consciousness? He says, certainly not, great king. Now that one, you might want to say, well, perhaps Nagasena is the soul, something immaterial. Nagasena is not any of the 5 skandhas. And now, of course, one response then is, well, if Nagasena is not any of the 5 skandhas, what is there left that could make up a self? Can we think of there being anything else that could make up the self that isn't included in the 5 skandhas? Now, maybe you might want to say it's the immaterial soul. The question is, what evidence is there for this? It's certainly not brought about by perception. So he says, certainly not, great king. Then the king says, O venerable, I question you again and again, and yet I fail to recognize Nagasena. In truth, then, Nagasena is for you nothing but a word. But what is this Nagasena here then? Venerable, you must be speaking a falsehood, a lie in saying there is no Nagasena. Then the elder Nagasena replied to King Menander as follows. You are, O great king, a delicate member of the ruling class, an exceedingly delicate prince. If you were to walk, O great king, in the middle of the day on hot, sandy ground, treading with your feet on rough gravel and coarse sand, your feet would become sore, your body would feel tired, and you would be emotionally distressed, your mind and body overwhelmed by sensation and pain and discomfort. Well then, did you come here on foot, or were you brought on a vehicle? Venerable, I did not come on foot, I came in a chariot. O great king, Nagasena says, if you came in a chariot, tell me then, is the chariot the pole? Perhaps he means the thing that, maybe ties it to like a horse pulling it. Now, of course, that's ridiculous to say the essence or the nature of a chariot is just the pole. And that's exactly what the King Menander says. Certainly not, venerable. Because we could just then isolate that one pole and we would say, yeah, that's definitely not a chariot. Other things can have a pole, and we don't say they're chariots. Is the chariot the axle, great king? Certainly not. Again, if we had an axle by itself, we wouldn't say, that's the nature of a chariot, an axle. Other things have axles and they aren't chariots, and it by itself, we don't call it a chariot, we call it an axle. Is the chariot the wheels, great king? Again, the wheels alone do not make a chariot. Is the chariot the frame? The wheels or the frame alone does not make a chariot, especially if you can have a frame and you can stand in it. It's not going to do what chariots do. Is the chariot the banner staff, great king? Certainly not, venerable. Is the chariot the harness, great king? Certainly not, venerable. Is the chariot the reins, great king? Certainly not, venerable. Is the chariot the goading stick, great king? He says, certainly not, venerable. Is the chariot then, O great king, all of these together, the pole, axle, wheels, chariot body, banner staff, yoke, reins, and goading stick, all taken together, that's what makes a chariot? Certainly not, great king. And why? Well, if the chariot were missing merely, let's say, the wheels, we would still point to the thing and say, yeah, that's a chariot, right? It just needs wheels. If we take off one wheel, because we're going to replace it, we wouldn't say, as long as it's missing that one wheel, it's not a chariot. That doesn't make sense. So, of course, those together, the totality of those things don't make a chariot a chariot. Is the chariot, then, something separate and distinct from pole, axle, wheels, chariot, body, banner, staff, yoke, reins, and goading stick, right? It's something else different from that. Well, what could it be? We can't think of anything else. There's nothing else, right? I mean, if we take all those different parts and we examine each of them, and every time we say it's not the chariot, we put it to the side, there'd be nothing left that we'd be looking at that was a chariot. So we can't say there's anything else distinct and separate from all those different parts that we say make up the chariot. So he says, O great king, I question you again and again, and yet I fail to recognize a chariot in your replies. In truth, then, chariot is for you nothing but a word. But what is the chariot here, then, O great king? You must be speaking falsehood, a lie, in saying there is no chariot. O great king, you are the greatest king in all the continents of India. Who do you fear that you speak a lie? May all of you, sirs, the 500 Greeks and the 80,000 monks listen to me. The great king Menander has said, I came in a chariot. But when he said, great king, if you came in a chariot, show me the chariot, he says, here you will find no chariot. Should one accept this as an intelligent answer? Now, of course, no, right? The king Menander is perplexed. So, when he had thus spoken, the 500 Greeks applauded the elder Nagasena, and spoke to Menander the king as follows. Now, O great king, answer if you can. Then King Menander replied to the elder Nagasena as follows. Venerable Nagasena, I speak no lie. The word chariot is a metaphor, a conceptual construct, a verbal designation, a convention, merely a name used with reference to the pole, with reference to the axle, with reference to the wheels, to the chariot body, and with reference to the banner staff. Instead, O great king, you understand well what a chariot is, in exactly the same manner when we speak of myself, Nagasena. This is a metaphor, a conceptual construct, a verbal designation, a convention, merely a name used with reference to the hair on the head, the hair on the body, the fingernails, and so on. But in the absolute sense, there is no person to be found here. In this connection, O great king, the nun Vajira declared in the presence of the Blessed One, just as when several parts are joined together, one uses the word chariot. When the aggregates of the personality are found together, the convention is to speak of a living being. So what then Nagasena has just argued is that, yeah, there is no chariot, because we take all those different parts, we examine each part, we say none of the parts by themselves is the nature or the essence of the chariot. Well, then we're left with nothing else. So then maybe it has to be all the parts taken together, put in their places. But we know that, well, if it's just missing one wheel, we wouldn't say that, it's not a chariot anymore. In the same way that we wouldn't say that if I have a terrible accident and I lose my arm, well, shoot, I don't have an arm anymore. I can't be Austin anymore. But we would still say I'm still Austin even if I lose an arm. Or if I lose some of the hair on my head, I'm still Austin. Could it then be something else besides any one of these parts that make up the chariot or that make up the self, that make up Austin? Is there something beyond my feelings, right? So does it really not matter what feelings I have or what memories I have? That none of those matter about what makes Austin Austin. It's something else beyond those. Well, there's no evidence. There's no empirical evidence of this. So what is left? There's nothing left. There is no chariot. It's a mere conceptual designation. There is no Austin. It's a mere conceptual label we place on things. But there is no Austin. There is no self. Now, the Buddhists argue, to make sense of this, that there are two conceptions of truth. So there's a distinction between a way in which a statement may be true, conventionally and ultimately. So a statement is conventionally true if and only if it is acceptable to common sense and consistently leads to successful practice. Now, of course, it is conventionally true that there is a self. It is conventionally true that there is an Austin because, of course, imagine I'm in a crowd of people and someone sees me, they perceive Austin, and they want to go and say, hey, Austin. Well, it doesn't make sense to say, hi, aggregate of parts that make up a self. Well, which aggregate of parts that make up a self? There are many, right? I'm in a crowd of people. So we say, Austin, this specific aggregate of parts that make up a self. But it's really no more than a label, because they say, ultimately, that statement, there is an Austin or there is a self, does not correspond to the facts that we just investigated. That when we look for the essence or the nature of a thing, of a self, we don't find it. So ultimately, it is false that there is a self, or ultimately true, there is no self. While it is conventionally true there is a self, in the same way that it's conventionally true that there is such a thing as a chariot, but it's ultimately true that there is no chariot. So the Buddhists advocate a kind of nominalism, right? They think that they're just things, each distinct, but there are no universals. There are no universal things that are selves. There are no universal things that are chariots, that are chairs. There's nothing that chairs share in common that really makes them what a chair is. So in a way, this is distinct from a kind of monism, like, again, Advaita Vedanta advocates, or even a kind of realism that Nyaya philosophy advocates, right? So Nyaya would say, yeah, we can have knowledge of the things of like a chair, of a self as it actually is. There's something unique in them that makes them selves that, can be universally true. Now, of course, Advaita Vedanta would say, well, actually, there's nothing really distinct. They're all actually quantitatively one thing, Brahman. And what the Buddhists are saying is that actually everything is quantitatively different, as well as, of course, qualitatively different. How does this make sense? Well, here's something Mark Sideritz says. He says, how does the word fire, for example, actually function? Consider the situation where we say we kept the fire burning by adding more fuel. Here, we are talking as if there is one enduring thing, the fire, that first consists of flames from kindling, then later consists of flames from logs, then still later consists of flames from new logs. This should tell us that fire is a convenient designator for a causal series of flames, right? So going back to the truth, the Buddhist truth that all things are dependently originated. One flame originates dependently from another flame. And this in turn means, he says, that no statement using the word fire can be ultimately true. There is no such thing as one fire that subsists throughout time. It's just a mere, designation to something that, of course, is many different constant, causal series of events of things being ignited. That we say, there is fires if it is one thing, when really it's a whole series of independent, well, not independent things, but dependently arising things. So that all that can be talked about, he says, at the ultimate level are individual flames, not the series of flames as a whole. Of course, it doesn't make sense to talk about, a series of individual flames. I think it would be very difficult to live life about, talking about, oh, did you see the fires that occurred yesterday over in near the lake? Fires? What fires? I just know of, one that occurred, right? One might say, thinking of this one fire. And you're like, no, 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 there were fires. And now someone's thinking, there were multiple fires? Clearly there's confusion that arises. So, of course, then, going back to the Buddhist nominalism, right? They're saying there are really all individual things that are different, uniquely different. We just put mere conceptual labels on them to make sense of them as humans. So we conventionally talk about there being things as like a fire or a person. Ultimately, there is no such thing as a fire or a person, though. There's no one thing that unites all these individual different things. Now, furthermore, we can go further and say, because there is no self, it is because not because there are a bunch of individual parts that are all, distinct in their individuality, but because those two aren't made up of anything as well. They're all empty. There is, though, a dispute about this. So the Abhidharmas think that, well, there must be some parts that make up all these things, that, the most basic parts, a kind of atomism they promote. Other Buddhists, like the Madhyamakas, argue that really all things are empty. There are no basic parts. Atomism is false, we could say, metaphysically, right? Not talking about the existence of actual atoms, but even then, of course, right? Atoms are dependent on even smaller things that make them up. And where does that end? Again, the Abhidharmas would say, well, it has to end somewhere, and the Madhyamakas would say, to say it has to end somewhere is just a conventional truth to make sense of it. Ultimately, there is no basic building block, we could say, of all things. We should consider, though, this argument that there is no self by the Buddhists, and the fact, that all things arise dependent on other things. How does this make sense for their belief in reincarnation, right? The cycle of samsara. I mean, that's the whole point of Buddhism, is to break the cycle of samsara to achieve nirvana, or nibbana in the Pali. If there is no self, right, then who is reborn in the next life? It makes sense to say, if there is no self, if there's an Austin, how can there be an Austin that's reborn? How can there be an Austin that does harm, that causes suffering through actions, or does good deeds, right, and decreases suffering? The answer is that no self is reborn, but another self arises dependently on prior actions. So Nagasena again says to the king Menander, "O great king, the same name and form here is not reborn in the next life. Rather, with this name and form here, great king, one performs actions, good or bad, as an effect of and accompanied by these actions. Another name and form is reconstituted in another life." So there are just good actions or bad actions. There is no self that performs these actions. There is just the fact of actions. They give some examples of this. Nagasena does to Menander. So one is like the mango or rice example. So say a farmer plants mangoes or plants rice, and a little bit later someone else goes and steals that rice or mangoes. Would we say, hey, the person really didn't steal the mangoes or rice, they didn't belong to the farmer who planted them? We would say they did belong to the farmer that planted them, and therefore that person stole the mango or rice. But why? Because we know the rice or the mango that was stolen, its existence depended on the farmer planting them. If the farmer did not plant them, there could be no rice or mango for which then the person could steal. So the actions that occurred gave rise to future actions, or at least future possible actions. Perhaps a better one, a candlelight fire example. If someone left a candle lit burning in their room, and it catches fire and burns down a house, which then burns down a whole neighborhood of houses, would we say, oh, it's not the fault of the person that left the candle burning, right? Because there is no self, and there's no single fire that burnt down all the houses. That was just different fires that burnt down the houses. It would make sense to say that. Even if we want to say there are individual fires that, caused the burning of all the different houses, we would say it originated somewhere. The existence of those different fires were dependent on previous fires that ignited them. And those previous fires were dependent on the original candle that was lit. And it was lit by the actions of that individual person, who would then be responsible, right, for the whole neighborhood burning down. So there are actions that occur that cause certain harm, that causes suffering in the future. So while there is no self that subsists throughout time that then is reborn as the same self, there are still other selves that are born. There are still other cases of suffering that exist that are dependent on prior actions. So there is no you, Austin, if I'm talking about myself, that is reborn in the next life, but there is a self that is born in the next life. And that self experiences certain things, and the cause of those things it experiences are dependent on prior actions by previous people. Now, perhaps this might say, yeah, okay, there is reincarnation, but it's like, again, right, because of the monism, we might want to say, or sorry, not monism, nominalism. Because of the nominalism, we might want to say, well, there is no, like, me, the me that I identify with now that's going to be reborn in the next life. Why should I care about, then, the actions that I do right now? Because it's not going to be me that's going to pay for them in the next life. It'll be some other self, that's going to have to pay for them. To answer that question, we would have to look at Buddhist morality.